public forum. And we are going to start our program, like we do all of our programs, with opening prayer. I'm going to ask Pastor Caitlin to please join us for opening prayer.
Let's join together in a word of prayer. Wonderful and wondrous God, we give you thanks for the many women that you have called to be a part of your work. We give you thanks for the women who have created our histories, the ones that you have called now, and those you have yet to call to do your work. We give you thanks for this afternoon, for drawing us together here, and we ask that you bless this time as we learn together, as we learn about one another, and as we grow closer to you. Amen. I'll just give the hosts welcome while I'm up here. My name is Caitlin Butler. I am the Associate Pastor here at Faith United Methodist Church. Thank you all for coming. We're really happy to be hosting Swift. Our relationship with Swift is something that is really important to our identity as Faith United Methodist Church. And possibly the most important thing I can say is that the bathrooms are in the back. If you take that ramp up on the left there's a set of bathrooms over here. And if you can do stairs, there's also a set of bathrooms. If you go to this side and turn right, it'll be on your right. Okay?
Thank you, Pastor, and thank you for hosting us. We love this this church, and we love coming here for all our events, our dinners, our forums, etc. So again, welcome to Swift Southwest Interfaith Team. We are a team of Christian churches, Muslim mosques, and synagogues, Jewish synagogues, and we come together every month to put together programs, events, service projects. Raise your hands if this is your first Swift event. Excellent, well, welcome. So I know we've got a beautiful day out today. So we had to compete with the weather. We have to compete with the Bears game, which is tied last I checked. So it's a problem. It's not a problem, but struggles we have all the time. So I suspect more people start coming in as the Bears game wraps up. I do a silent prayer for them that they win in any event. So Swift comes together. We do forums like this twice a year. We do dinners. We've got a dinner in November next month. We do service projects. We go to the food depository. We go to the local forest preserves and clean the forest preserves. We work with Habitat for Humanity. And we do various events throughout the year. Please check out our website, swiftinterfaith.org. We've been an organization now for over 15 years, doing programs like these in the south and west suburbs, and it's a great event. I am the Muslim co-chair. I work with the Jewish co-chair, Ernie Radowitz, and the Christian co-chair, Marilyn. Where is Marilyn? Oh, there, okay. And then we have board members. We are 18 congregations strong and growing. In addition, this year, this month, we have a billboard. Oh. We have this billboard. It just went up this month. We prepared bumper stickers. So I welcome everybody to, before you leave, to take a bumper sticker. I call these sticker-friendly bumper stickers. So they will peel off your bumper very nicely. Not like the old days where they were there forever, permanent. So we do ask, these cost money. We do ask for a nominal donation just to help us offset the cost for these bumper stickers. 50 cents, $1, whatever is in your heart. Nothing, you can take these for free. That's no problem. So welcome to Swift. We have a great program for you this evening. I'd like to introduce Carl Wolf from Respond Now. We do a lot of work with Respond Now. We enjoy working with Respond Now, and we thank them for all the work that they do. Carl?
Thank you, and I guess I won't apologize for my informal dress, but I feel like I should have perhaps put on a button-up shirt anyway. But thank you for having me here today. Respond Now is an agency that provides health, hunger, and housing services in Chicago Heights. Basic services for people who are in need. You think about that which you cannot live without. You think about your home, the water, the electricity, the food. the medication, the clothes, the transportation, and you have to have those things. And as we all know, in this country and throughout the world, there are people who do not have those things, unbelievably, when we live in a world of such great abundance. And so, Respond Now for almost 50 years now, September 5th, 1969, which I remember as their incorporation day because I was married on September 5th, 1998. Not 1969, before my time. Almost 50 years now, we've been, I think, an important part of the community of the far south suburbs and an accessible agency, not only for the people who are in need, but because you have to be accessible. You can't put up barriers. You have to be there and have your doors open. But I also think an accessible agency for the people of the south suburbs who want to donate and volunteer their time. I know that we have at least one volunteer in here who's been there for a long time. So if you want to ask her, I won't call her out unless she wants to raise her hand. You can ask her how wonderful it is to volunteer there. And so it's important to be accessible to those who are in need and to those who want to give and be part of the community. Because it's tough out there. It's a tough world we live in. And it's easy to become cynical when we go on year after year and think things aren't getting better and people are still in poverty. But I think what you will find at Respond Now more than anything is something that is true to the Muslim and the Christian and the Jewish faiths is the idea of love. And that love for our fellow people, man, woman, humankind, is paramount if we want to continue to serve in a way that's heartfelt and of equal footing and in just treating people with ultimately the dignity and respect that we all deserve. And so come to Respond Now and you will feel that love, whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, Unitarian, whatever it may be. It's powerful. And we do it in the service of those of our brothers and sisters who are in need. So thank you very much. Thank you. You guys donated hygiene products. So thank you for your work at the Food Depository. We're a member agency of the Food Depository. And please, I'll leave some brochures and stop by anytime at Respond Now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl, and God bless you and Respond Now for all the good work that you guys do. So we team up with Respond Now practically for all of our events. And we always ask people for our dinners, for our forums, to bring in something. Either we'll pick food, we'll pick toiletries. During back to school, we'll ask you to bring back to school stuff. So this event today, we asked you to bring toiletries. So thank you so much for bringing those things. Carl will take us back with him, and they will go to absolutely good use. So Swift is a congregation of congregations. We are 18 members strong, and purpose of Swift is to learn from one another. We do not debate, we don't argue, we don't try to convert the other, we don't try to be better than the other. We are here to learn from one another. We don't talk politics. That's kind of the cardinal rule of Swift, is no politics, because politics does divide. We highlight our differences and celebrate our similarities. You will see to my left here on the tables that there are poster boards and trifolds that each Swift member has prepared for their congregation. I invite you all, before today's event is over, to take a look at the different organizations that are members of Swift. There's some flyers and books and handouts. Those are all free to take. Please don't take the trifolds. Those come back with us. Also in the back, there's food and drink and coffee. We will have a break after our three speakers and then start with the question and answer. So without further ado, I will introduce our Christian co-chair, Sister Marilyn, for the program introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm a little bit shorter. I want to thank you. Oh. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed, for the introduction. As Mohammed said, SWIFT sponsors many activities. And we all want to participate as much as possible because our purpose is to build bridges with respect, understanding, fellowship. Today we have 3 speakers who will lead us in that. Our topic is Women in Faith. Each will speak 20 minutes from the perspective of their respective religions, the Jewish, the Muslim, and the Christian faith. There's a 20-minute limit to each speaker, and Chris is here right in the front row, and he will put up a sign when you have 5 minutes left. And then he'll put up another sign when you have 1 minute left that you have to wind down, and then he'll let you know when that's it. That's it. Also, there will be people walking around with little pieces of paper and pencils. So if at any time you have a question, just put your hand up and they will give you a little slip of paper with pencil. You can address your question to any speaker individually, particular speaker, or to all 3. Because after the 3 speakers have their presentation, we'll have a break, and then we'll have a question and answer period. So that's always a very, very interesting time. And I'm sure you're going to find these forums, just like I have, always very, very encouraging and informative. Very good material, as we all learn, continually learn. Well, since we're in for this good afternoon, I'm going to just start introducing the first speaker. Our first speaker is Hind Maki. She is an interfaith educator who holds a degree in international relations from Brown University. She develops and delivers trainings on active citizenship through interfaith action, anti-racism, education, and youth empowerment. She travels throughout the United States and Western Europe, working with diverse communities, leading workshops with civic leaders, interfaith activists, and university students. She serves on the Islamic Society of North America's Mosque Inclusion Task Force and the Brother Jeffrey Gross Institute for Dialogue, Justice, and Social Action at Lewis University. We welcome you, Hind Maki.
Thank you so much, Sister Marilyn, for that introduction, and thank you so much to the SWIFT team for the invitation to return. This is not my first time speaking here, and this is not actually my first time with SWIFT because I was part of the Orland Park Prayer Center SWIFT team several years ago, and so I'm always happy to be back. I feel like this is home. So I am happy that you're here right in front of me because I can talk. And the topic of women in Islam is one that has required often volumes of books and whole courses in seminaries. It's very difficult to whittle it down to 20 minutes, but I'll try. And because I'm whittling it down to 20 minutes, I will be necessarily not talking about everything. So I've kind of identified a few points or themes that I think are really important for me as a Muslim woman and for you as an audience, mixed faith audience, to learn or maybe to get to know more about women in Islam and how Islam views women and girls. So as I start, I want to share with you a small interaction that I had when I was about 10 years old. It was the first Gulf War, so that's about how old I was. And I was in 5th grade. And one of the bullies in school, and she was a bully, there's no other way to say it, came up to me one day and she said, "Oh, hey, Hind, how many wives does your dad have?" I was like, what? It was such a strange question because my family was one of the few black families in the school and one of like 2 Muslim families in school, right? People knew us. My parents were quite ubiquitous. My dad with his afro, my mom with her jilbab. And there were no other adult women that she would see. And I was startled. I was just, thinking, what is this question, right? But I wasn't witty back then. I was only 10. So I didn't have any snarky kind of response to give to her. But, I just said, he only has one wife. Like, it's such a strange question. And as she and the other mean girls ran away, I could hear them yelling, "Not without my daughter." Now, Not Without My Daughter, some of you might know this film. It was from earlier in the 80s, but it's based on a true story of an American woman who married an Iranian man. And when they moved back to Iran, he kind of flipped into being a really terrible and abusive husband. And this movie was made of her experience escaping Iran and taking her daughter with her and coming back to the United States. And I guess the cable channels were replaying it during the Gulf War, go figure. So, I was just, thinking, Not Without My Daughter, this is about Iran, my family's from Sudan, like, I don't understand where she's linking, me to what she saw on TV. But even at that age, I kind of understood 3 things. One is that most of the people that I will interact with here in America don't really know that much about Islam. They don't know, right? And either they'll ask me or they'll tell me. Either they'll ask me nicely. And by the way, during the Q&A session, you can ask me whatever you want. Believe me, I've had worse. You all look very, very nice. I probably will not be offended by any question that you might have. And then the second is that most the people that I would interact with, if they know anything about Islam and Muslims, they'll see it from TV, something that is curated for them. Right, and they won't necessarily question what they see. And then the third is that there's the stereotype for the first time that I had ever kind of encountered, that Muslim women were passive and were treated as objects by Muslim men. And the reason this was a strange phenomenon for me was because that was not my experience at home. Right, my father, one father, he had one wife. My mother, who's his equal. And they made the decisions in our household, and my sister and me. And there was nothing in my experience growing up in a very religious, observant, practicing Muslim family that made me feel that I was less than, right? And so that was always part of my consciousness, even at 10 years old. And it continued to be part of my consciousness as I attended an all-girls Islamic high school in Bridgeview, just down the road, 20 minutes from here. And what's really phenomenal about this school, about many other things that are really great about it, is that I learned about Islam, about my relationship with God, and I grew as an adolescent. First of all, I was in the mosque, right? So we felt ownership of the mosque. And secondly, I learned from women teachers. I learned the Quran from women. I learned the Arabic language, which I spoke at home, but I learned it more deeply from women. I learned the history of Islam from women. When we had speakers who came from outside, very, very rarely were they men. When we had lecturers to come speak about social justice or history or whatever, what have you, about Islam, all of my education was from Muslim women. And so I never, in my experience, this question of why is it that women are seen as less than, right? And the stereotype of Muslim women being oppressed, I didn't understand it. Certainly, I saw families where there was domestic violence, right? But it wasn't the only Muslim story that I knew. And so, as I grew older, I wanted to dive into that a little bit deeper. And every place that you start in Islam, you have to start with God, right? We always start Bismillahi ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Those of you who know Hebrew in the audience might think these words are familiar. This Rahman, Rahim, Rahma. right? These are names of God, some of the 99 attributes of God in the Islamic tradition. The word rahma means mercy. It comes from the Arabic word, and I suppose also the Hebrew word for rahim, which is womb. This is quite a feminine kind of attribute, one of, some people might say, of God. And so this from the beginning of every activity Muslims do, you begin it by saying, in the name of God, the beneficent, the merciful, right? And so this understanding of God as having the attributes that are often sort of described to women, right, has always been part of my tradition. Maybe Muslim men wouldn't describe it that way, but it was the way it was that I felt was most natural. So let me start, not quite at the beginning, but with human creation and that timeless struggle of humanity and temptation, or humanity and the ego. So in the Quran, in Surah 49, the small rooms, many of you might know this this verse, if you're interfaith veterans, that says, "O mankind, behold, we have created you all out of a male and a female, and have made you into nations and tribes, so that you may come to know one another. Indeed, the noblest of you in the sight of God is the one who is most deeply conscious of God. Behold, God is all-knowing and all-aware." A lot of interfaith people will know this because seems pretty self-explanatory. It's also a great verse to challenge racism. But also, for today's conversation, it connects back to the first man and to the first woman. In the Muslim story of human creation, Eve is not and was not considered the temptress and the person who led mankind, down to temptation, right? The Quran is pretty clear about her role in kind of the interaction between Adam and Eve and Satan. And in Quran chapter 7, the heights, God said, "O Adam, dwell you and your wife in the garden, and eat both of you from wherever you of it so please, but neither you shall come near this single tree to eat of its fruit, for then you shall both be of the wrongdoers." Then Satan whispered to both of them to expose what had been hidden from them of their secret parts. Thus Satan said to them, "Your Lord has forbidden from you this tree only so that you would become not angels or become immortal." And he swore to them, "Indeed, I am truly of good counsel to both of you." Thus he caused them to fall into sin by way of delusion. Now, in the Muslim tradition, Eve and Adam immediately understood their wrongdoing and asked and were sincerely repentant and asked forgiveness from God, who gave them forgiveness. But the Quran is very, very clear that the actions that they took, the seduction by the devil, that it was both of them together. And so there's always this equality, this duality between the first man and the first woman, right? They made the mistake together. They felt bad about it together. They repented together, and they were forgiven together. And that's the origin of humankind, as Muslims believe so. And also part of the Eve and Adam story is that women and girls have the very basic right to life. Right, and this is, I'm talking here, and I will be continuing to speak about what the texts and the traditions have to say about women and girls. This is not necessarily the reality around the world, right, today nor at that time. And I think it's really, it's been very critical in the Muslim tradition, the way Muslims teach how Islam was revealed and when it was revealed. One of the most sort of critical points of pre-Islamic Arabia that Muslims often point to as a change that occurred after Islam was revealed was the way women and girls were treated, and specifically this practice of female infanticide that occurred among the pre-Islamic Arabs. And we see this in Surah 81, the enfolding. It's a very, if you know Arabic, it's a very kind of stark and beautiful chapter of the Quran. But it's talking about the Day of Judgment, and on the Day of Judgment, the girl child who had been killed will be asked, for what sin were you murdered, right? And so this idea that in the Quran, Muslims believe that there's a description of how women and girls' lives were not treated with respect, and weren't even considered important in pre-Islamic Arabia. And we also have stories about this from the time of the Prophet. So you have a community of people who were used to burying their infant daughters alive, right? And immediately after, the revelation of these verses and the revelation that all life is important and critical and sacred to God, Abu Bakr, who is one of the closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, immediately decided to take it upon himself, and he was wealthy in the community, that any man to whom a girl child was born, he would go to him and say, listen, don't bury your daughter. How much do you want for her? And he would literally kind of buy the girl. He started what we would consider today to be a boarding house for girls, where they would be educated and protected until they came of age and got married, which he paid for and funded. And he had kind of hired women to sort of be in this house to protect these girls. And so we see, a community that had previously practiced female infanticide, immediately after they learn, that this is not a great thing, that God is not interested in people who kill their daughters, this sort of immediate change, or at least that's the Muslim tradition, the way it is taught to us. And so, as I mentioned about the basic right to live and to sort of pursue a life, what is life without rights to inherit and to choose your own way of living and to be independent and to actually be seen as a servant of God? And I think here we have a really important underpinning of the equality of men and women, very, very clearly laid out in the Quran. In chapter 33, which is the federated clans, Surah Al-Ahzab in Arabic. Now, men and women have equal rights and responsibilities in Islam, whether it's religious ritual, whether it's their relationship to God. And this particular verse that I'll share in a minute came about under really interesting conditions. The first was that it was actually referring, the entire chapter is referring to a time of a battle with the Muslims' enemies, and there were all these hypocrites, and there was a lot of bloodshed. So there was a lot of kind of challenges within the community, right? And as the community felt like they were being attacked from outside of the Muslim community, some of the Muslim women, most well-known among them, the wife of the Prophet, Salama, asked the Prophet, why is the Quran seem only to refer to men, only to address men? Why doesn't it ever address women? And Muslims believe that this particular verse was revealed specifically to answer to this question of Salama. And it's verse 33, it's chapter 33, verse 35. Indeed, the Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women, the obedient men and obedient women, the truthful men and truthful women, the patient men and patient women, the humble men and humble women, the charitable men and charitable women, the fasting men and fasting women, the men who guard their private parts, and the women who do so, and the men who remember God often, and the women who do so. For them God has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. So as I mentioned, this verse is in a chapter that is about a war or about a battle. And so it's no small thing that during this time of upheaval, a woman's question was heard, was listened to, and was responded to, right? And just a note on Salama herself. By the way, her first name was Hind. A lot of people don't know this. Salama is just her nickname. She's the mother of Salama. She was a legal scholar who was consulted by the Prophet, peace be upon him, on many matters, including on the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which was a 10-year peace treaty with the Meccan clans that allowed for the Muslims who were living in Medina to go and to perform Hajj in 628. And after his death, the death of the Prophet, she narrated in the Sunni tradition 378 narrations of the Prophet. So she was known as a legal scholar and a scholar of the Prophet's teachings and his examples. Another chapter or another verse in the Quran that talks about the spiritual equality between men and women is in chapter 9, verse 71. It talks about how men and women are allies of one another. As for the believing men and the believing women, all of them are allies of one another. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. Moreover, they establish the prayer, give charity, and they obey God and his messenger. It is these upon whom God shall have mercy. Indeed, God is overpowering, all wise. So, continuing to stress the spiritual equality in the sight of God between men and women is really, really important. And it's very important for men to be allies of women and girls, whether it's trying to stop child marriages around the world, whether it's promoting education of women and girls, and just supporting the women around them. We, as Muslims, believe that this is not only part of our historical tradition, but also a spiritual kind of commandment by God, as described here in the Quran. And I've been mentioning some of these rituals that both men and women have to offer. Many of you are familiar with prayer or fasting during the month of Ramadan, or giving the charity. One of them is going to the pilgrimage of Hajj, to offer at least once in your lifetime. Both men and women who are able, who have the financial means, who are healthy enough, are asked to go and to perform this pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, it's very interesting. If any of you have gone on this ritual, or if any of you have seen this on TV, I know Channel 11 often brings, sort of clips of this every year. You see some of the, one of the most kind of interesting visuals of this is Muslims who are going around the Kaaba, and they're going around it 7 times, and Muslims going around from one mound to the next mound 7 times. These rituals are part of the actual sacred rituals of Hajj. If you don't do it, you haven't done Hajj, right? And there's a tradition in Islam, we believe in the Islamic tradition, that the Prophet Abraham built the Kaaba with his son Ismail in the space that it is today, in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia. This is a kind of male-oriented story, and we forget about Ismail, or Ishmael's mother, Hajar or Hagar, in the Christian and Jewish traditions. And in the Muslim tradition, once she had her baby, Ismail, the Prophet Abraham was told, send her away to this desert in the middle of nowhere. And at first, Hagar was kind of shocked. Do you mean to tell me, are you doing this, or did God tell you to put me out in the desert with my baby? And Prophet Abraham said, well, this is a commandment from God. So she's there with her baby in the middle of the desert, trying to figure out, how can I get water? And in the Muslim tradition, she went from one, sorry, that was like 1 minute. She went from one mound to the next 7 times. And her running from each mound 7 times is part of the ritual of Hajj. And I want to mention, and I'm going to ask you to also ask me these during the Q&A session, that the Muslim traditions are also, we share a lot of the traditions that you see in the Christian and Hebrew Bibles, but the stories are somewhat different. So I would ask for you, if somebody could ask me some questions to share that during my Q&A session, I'd be happy to share a few of those stories of that. And I also want to just end with this last, just a last quote from a male scholar of Islam who is a descendant of the Prophet. His name is Habib Ali Jifri, and he says, having female scholarship restores divine balance. And so there's this idea of a balance in Islam, always night and day, male and female, etc. Because God created everything in pairs. If we don't fulfill this balance, we won't get the fruits of divine balance. And then ending with the chapter of the women in the Quran, the first verse in that chapter, it says, O mankind, fear your Lord, who has created you from a single soul, and from it he created its mate, and from them both he brought forth multitudes of men and women. Be mindful of God, through whom you demand your mutual rights, and revere the wombs that bore you. Surely God is ever watching over you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hind, Maki. I'm sure each of us have learned something that we did not know. And this will continue with our next speaker also, which is Rabbinit Alea Sarna. She's a director of religious engagement in Ashe Shalom B'nai Israel congregation in Chicago. She has worked with youth, and she has been the clergy intern at Harvard Hillel Ohev Sholom, the National Synagogue, and the Hebrew Institute of White Plains. She has clinical pastoral education at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital and served as a visiting chaplain at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. We welcome you, Rabbinit Leah Sarna.
Sorry for all the hard words in my bio. So I think what I want to do is take a moment to tell you about where things stand right now on this subject, and then kind of push backwards into history from before that. So right now, there are women who are ordained in every Jewish denomination. The first woman who was ordained in the Reform movement was named Regina Jonas in Europe in 1935. She was killed in the Holocaust. Then it took a little while for the Reform movement to get back on track with that. So Rabbi Sally Priesand was ordained by the Reform movement in 1972, Amy Eilberg by the Conservative movement in 1985, and my teacher, Sarah Horowitz, in the Orthodox movement in 2009. That then started the seminary that I attended, and from which I graduated in June, was ordained. So just to give you a sense, though, that's all very, very recent, where women were beginning to be allowed into the leadership structures of a many thousand-year-old tradition that until 1935 was entirely dominated by men, who did a great job, but but I mean, it just reflects that feminism kind of made its way into Judaism now sort of fully, but that took a long time, and Judaism has always sort of reflected the world around it in certain ways. So when you had a world where all of the leadership was male, of course in Judaism all of the leadership was male, and a world where the vast majority of the scholarship was being done by men, so too in Judaism. In a world where women were illiterate, Jewish women were also illiterate, which means that although Judaism puts tremendous stock in education, most of that energy went towards men. So unless women needed it for some practical purpose, a lot of women were not reading and were not writing, which means that we don't have a ton of evidence about what women were doing. The evidence we have is filtered through texts and documents that were written by men and carried and interpreted by men and kind of carried forward into history by men. So we have early stories about women, many of which you're familiar with and which we'll discuss in a minute, but a lot of it is kind of piecing together these what we can learn from surrounding culture about what we imagine women were doing and what we can learn from kind of fragmentary documents or things that we discover through more like historical ways of acquiring knowledge than we do through sort of religious ways of acquiring knowledge, because most of our religious texts don't carry the voices of women forward with them, which means that my kind of very traditional Talmudic education, which I received in seminary, meant that I was spending all day, every day, studying texts that were written by men, meant to be consumed by men, including texts that kind of govern the working of women's bodies. So texts that are about birth and menstruation that were all written by men with their assumptions about how women's bodies work and feel, which is very interesting, and with full and deep respect for what these men were trying to do, which is to help Jews live like beautiful, God-fearing Jewish lives. But it's like a very interesting moment and a very interesting way to be a woman, as with a sense of this inheritance that's so male-dominated and yet so mine, and that's what I have, and that's how Jewish people have been interpreting the Word of God for thousands of years with that lens. So that's like one of my favorite topics, so I'm happy to discuss that more in the Q&A if you're interested. But I do want to tell you about So with that as background, part of the problem is like, okay, Leah, so like, where do you find yourself? How do you read these texts, and who speaks to you in them when you're a woman? So the first thing is to say that, like, even though we don't have records, I believe, and through my family's oral history, I should back up and say for a minute that my family is very unique among European Jews of European descent, which is that my family did not lose our train of family memory in the Holocaust. Most people whose families come from Poland, the way that mine does, they don't have family memory the way that my family does. But in my family, I have stories about my great-great-grandmothers, and even earlier than them, because my family made it to London before the Holocaust. My grandfather was a firefighter in London during the Blitz, but we weren't murdered in gas chambers. And so that's like a real inheritance that I have that most Jews are not privileged to have. And what I know about these women is that they were total powerhouses, and that they kind of had many, many children whom they taught all sorts of things, and they were the negotiators and the business people and kind of the brains behind the family's continuity and success. And those are the exact stories that we see from our earliest texts. So in Genesis, we have stories about Sarah and Abraham and Sarah being partners. So when guests come to visit Abraham, the angels come to visit Abraham, who welcomes them? Well, maybe Abraham welcomes them with words, but Sarah is the one running around getting the food ready, making sure everything feels like home for them. The Jewish tradition has, on top of the Torah text, we have what we call midrash, which is kind of like Torah fan fiction, but very, very old. 2,000-year-old Torah fan fiction. And the Midrash tells us that the Torah says Abraham like made souls in Haran, and those people came with them to Canaan. And the Midrash tells us that, Abraham converted men and Sarah converted women, that there was women's leadership for other women back to our earliest forefather and foremother. We have stories even predating that are more universal. The Midrash tells us that Noah, whose story we read in synagogue just this past Shabbat, he saved all the animals, but his wife, whose name is Naamah, she saved all the plants. And that when we have plants in the world, that's because Naamah took the initiative, and we don't have a story in the Bible about God commanding anyone to save the plants. We have the animals, they go on, husband and wife, in 2s and 7s, but how did the plants survive? Most of the trees you see outside would not survive in a flood. Well, it's because Naamah took the trees, brought them on the ark, saved the plants. And similarly, we have these women taking great initiative. That's how Rebecca ends up married to Isaac. That's how Jacob ends up married to Rachel and Leah, is because you have these women taking initiative. These men come. Eliezer comes to the well, and he says, like, who's going to feed me water? And he waits. The right woman for Isaac is going to be the woman who takes initiative. And that's how he ends up with Rebecca. And similarly, Moses runs away. He runs away to Midian because he injured or killed a man, and how does he meet his wife Zipporah? Well, she takes initiative again at the well in terms of making him feel welcome and giving him comfort. And in Egypt, again, we have a strong tradition that the Jewish women in Egypt are what kept the Jews alive during that time of slavery. So we have in Exodus 1, we have stories of Shiphrah and Puah, who Pharaoh says to them, kill all the Jewish babies, and they say, meh. And they keep all the babies alive, and then Pharaoh says to them, come on, what are you doing? You're supposed to kill the babies. And they're like, well, I don't know, we can't. And similarly, so there's stories in the Midrash, again, that's a fan fiction, the Midrash where the Jewish men said to their wives, we have to separate, like we can't bring babies into the world if they're just going to die. And the Jewish women said back to them, what are you talking about? Well, maybe, first of all, that's not showing a lot of faith that God will save us. And second of all, the only ones that are going to die are the boy babies. We can at least bring more Jewish babies into the world, and they'll be girls. And so the women then seduce their husbands into making more babies with them, and that's how the Jewish people survived during that time in Egypt. And in merit of those righteous women, we see there's all sorts of stories about how things that happen in the merit of those righteous women who kept the Jewish people alive in Egypt. And that same thing carries forward. We have the daughters of Zelophehad who say, we don't have any brothers. Who's going to inherit our father when we enter the land of Israel? And Moses is like, well, I don't know. That's a good question. And then goes and consults with God. And then there's like a whole change in Jewish law or in Torah law because these women kind of went forward and went to Moses and said, what about us? Don't leave us out. Why should we have anything less? And that changes this like very kind of seemingly narrow area of inheritance law. But inheritance law is everything. You're going into the land. How are you going to survive if you don't have land? And those same laws kind of carry over into the book of Ruth, where we have some strong female role models in Ruth and Naomi. But again, they go back. They kind of have this land. They don't have full rights to it. They're impoverished. And yes, they require Boaz or the other redeemer who makes an appearance at the end of the book to kind of redeem them through marriage, and then they can kind of return to their former status. But these women know the rules, and they're like totally conniving about how to make it through and navigate those rules. And then they make it into the text, which is like really amazing. You might have thought like, well, they're not important. Like the men are important in this society. The men have all the privileges. Yes, they do, but the women make it into the story because of their righteousness and because of their desire to like settle in the land and love it and live in it. And so that's kind of the daughters of Zelophehad and Ruth and Naomi. And again, we have women making sacrifices for Jewish continuity. That's also a major theme of the book of Esther. She saves the entire Jewish people. So on the one hand, we have almost no literature from Jews for generations, from Jewish women for generations. And on the other hand, we have all of these stories. Admittedly, many of them are rather domestic and sort of difficult to imagine, like what would Sarah, our foremother, say if she saw a woman running for president? I know I'm not supposed to talk about politics, but you'll forgive me for a second. Like running for president of the United States. Like what would she say about that? And it's truly hard to know the answer because potentially Sarah would say, no, like women belong in the house, making the house comfortable, as many women felt for thousands of years of what it meant to be a woman. And so to say today is like kind of a liberated 21st century woman, yes, I connect back to those women. How does that work? That's kind of complicated. And I think it's complicated for all people of faith who look backwards to their thousands of year old tradition and say, well, I'm connected to that, even though I live in this vastly different world, even though what it means to be a woman today is vastly different. I look back to them as role models, and I hope that they would be proud of me, even though I'm navigating this totally different world with a totally different set of rights and privileges. And that's just something we have to kind of like think about a lot, and I guess to borrow some language from my Christian colleagues, like pray on. And hope for that someday when we kind of meet these people in the next world, they'll say, yeah, you guys did it right. Because we don't know, it's new. What we're doing is new. Hopefully we're doing it right. But I'll just say a few other things, which is, I don't know what my time looks like. Am I doing okay? Yeah, okay, great. So we were given some kind of like things to make sure you talk about. So one of them was overview of women's rights referred to and addressed in your scriptures. So this is very interesting because Jews don't 100% believe in rights. We're much more about obligation, or at least in Orthodoxy, we're about obligation. So the Torah has 613 commandments, and those commandments are the rules that govern every element of our life, from like how you use the restroom to, I don't know, how you make purchases. The other day I was at the store and the woman who was checking me out, like she put through some lettuce and it didn't beep and it didn't show up on there, and she was just like, pack my bag, and I was like, you missed the lettuce, like, can you rescan it? And she was like, why? And I was like, because I'm not allowed to steal. And she was like a little bit confused by that, and I was like, no, God, like it's, God commanded me not to steal. So when we talk about like things that like it's not, rights are not the things that bring dignity to Jews in the perspective of Orthodoxy. It's obligation and commandment, and following those commandments are what help people lead dignified lives. And we use language of like observance. That's like the highest compliment you can pay an Orthodox Jew is like, well, she's very observant, or like he's very observant. And we don't mean like you see things well, we mean like you observe well. Because you observe the commandments. And women are obligated in the vast majority of those commandments. But what's interesting is that women traditionally are exempt from one category, which is, we call them time-bound positive commandments. So that's a little confusing, so let's break it down. Positive commandments are things like, take the 4 species of plants on the holiday of Sukkot, like pick them up, hold them, shake them around. Like, I don't know if that's something anyone here is familiar with, but there's a holiday that was a couple weeks ago, and Jews hold plants, or Orthodox Jews hold plants during that holiday. And so that would be like a positive commandment, like take the plants, pick them up, hold them. Okay, cool. And a negative commandment would be like, do not steal. So anything with like a not in it would be a negative commandment, anything with like a do would be a positive commandment. And so then time-bound, so the difference between time-bound and not time-bound would be like, I don't know, do love your neighbor as yourself, not a time-bound commandment. Pick up plants on the 15th day of the 7th month, time-bound. Right? Everyone following? And so women are exempt, so the picking up of plants, for example, women are exempt from it. And it's just on the minds that happened recently. There's not so many of those things. They're actually pretty limited, but the reason we're exempt from them is because there's this sense that, or at least one of the many, I should say also, Judaism is a very multivocal tradition, so anything I say in the name of Judaism, like there's some other Jew who's fully qualified to say the total opposite. But one of the many ideas about why women are exempt from time-bound positive commandments is that if women's obligations are primarily in the home, then like children don't if a child needs to go to the bathroom, like they're not waiting like the 10 minutes that you need to do your thing. And so like there's a certain amount of flexibility that is involved in being the primary caretaker of children and of the home that men don't necessarily need. Or that only, to say in like a more modern spin on it, like only maybe one half of the couple at a time needs to be able to have that kind of flexibility. So if you're gonna have some things that are rigid, like this must happen at this time on this day, you can't obligate 2 people in that who are also trying to build a Jewish family. And so that's kind of the traditional way of understanding that exemption. The downside is that exemption then gives privilege, because privilege is conferred through observance. So like the more commandments you have, the more privileged you are in a traditional Jewish context. So a lot of women of my generation are then saying, well, okay, I'm not commanded, but at least in the Ashkenazi tradition, in the Ashkenazi Jewish legal tradition, I still am permitted to do all of those time-bound positive commandments, and I will, as a way of sort of reclaiming and the amount of privilege that has historically been conferred to men through those commandments. And that's kind of a movement that we're seeing recently. That's sort of an interesting change in Jewish law. Cool. The only one last thing I wanted to say, and I think with that I'll just conclude. There's like way too much to say, so I'll just I'll just stop at some point. But I thought what my colleague was saying about God being Rachaman, from this word that takes its root from the womb, was very interesting. We of course also refer to God in that way, and in our tradition we have this whole feminine presence of God, the Shekhinah, which is the element of God that is kind of most tangible on earth. Shekhinah comes from the word l'shachin, which is the same word as the Mishkan, which was the tabernacle in the desert before we got to the temple, before we were able to build a physical temple in one place in Jerusalem. We had a tabernacle, and the tabernacle traveled around, and that comes from the word Mishkan, which is the word Shachin, which is the word Shekhinah. It's all the same root, Semitic root, and it means presence. or dwelling, and that is like a feminine element of God. Like the element of God that is like the most present in this world is a feminine one, and when Jews gather to study Torah, that is like the element of God that we imagine is present. So the element of God that is like the most present to Jews when Jews gather and when Jews do positive Jewish things like study Torah, is that feminine element of God, which I really love to tap into, especially because, as I mentioned at the beginning, for a long time women were not literate and not taught Torah texts. This century is probably the first time that you really have women reaching the highest levels of scholarship, and to be honest, I don't even think we're there yet. For men, who, like, Jewish texts are many and complicated, and they also span many languages. And so to say that you're an expert in Jewish texts, you would only reach that level around age, like, unless you're some kind of prodigy, but even then, like, or you probably have to be a prodigy to really reach that level, and that would be like you're 70 and you've been studying these texts full time since you were like 4 or 5 years old. And there's nowhere on earth that really gives women those opportunities yet. And so, but like women for the first time are at least gaining literacy in these texts, in the Talmud, and not in translation, kind of in their original and with all their kind of traditional commentaries. And so to say like women gather, we study these texts, and like the feminine aspect of God is there with us when we do it. That's like a very strong image that motivates a lot of my work and a lot of the kind of small shifts that we're trying to bring about within our own community. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to further conversation.
Thank you very much, Rabbinic Leah Sarna. I just want to remind all of you that have any questions, there's papers and pencils around. People are standing, and they will just put your hand up because we're going to have a great question and answer period after the break. Our third and last speaker is Reverend Mary Rawlinson. She is an ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church, currently serving as a counselor with people who are in the hospital for detoxification, poverty, addiction, homelessness, and those who have been incarcerated. She was awarded the Myrtle Sailor Spear Award for contribution to the expansion of the vision of women in ministry and theological scholarship. And her article, "What Will You Do?" was published in the 2012 Journal of the Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics. We welcome you, Reverend Mary Rawlinson.
Thank you, sister. And I want to thank Jessie Cunningham for inviting me here today. It was a bit of a risk she took, imagining I'd have something interesting to say to you all. So thank you, and thank you to my colleagues for such an amazing witness to the impact that women have in our faiths in the world. When I think about Christianity, you can get the slide up, I think that it began with a woman. Mary, the mother of God, the Theotokos, or God-bearer. In our tradition, in our scriptures, she's depicted as thoughtful, courageous, independent, someone who willingly sacrifices her own well-being for the sake of God's plan of salvation by saying yes to God. In his own life, Jesus spoke to, touched, healed, forgave, and looked at, saw women as human beings. Jesus traveled with women, as depicted in the Gospel of Luke, where it is written, Jesus traveled through the cities and villages, preaching and proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. The 12 were with him, along with some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses. Among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been thrown out, Joanna, the wife of Herod's servant Chuza, Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. To me, this is one of these subversive moments in our Bible where women had resources and they had control over them, and they traveled around with Jesus and his male followers and supported them and provided for them. It's not something we assume about women in the ancient world, But here's this moment of, no, women had power and they had some money, and these women chose to use them in their devotion and following of Jesus. Jesus also learned from women. One woman, known as the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman, was a pagan, a Gentile woman who demanded that he heal her daughter. And Jesus ponders this question, like, no, I didn't come to heal your people. And he uses some language that we often question today. He says, would you give the food meant for dogs, meant for children, would you throw that to the dogs? Which is kind of a strange thing for Jesus to say. And the woman persists, and he does heal her daughter. And it seems to be a moment where Jesus learns from her that his mission is broader than what he thought it was originally. Jesus wanted us to learn from the women around him, too. In all four Gospels, we see a woman walk into a man's house where Jesus is having dinner and anoint Jesus with oil or perfume, an act which upsets and even outrages the other men at the dinner table. In two of these versions, Jesus says, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So her memory is absolutely linked to the story of Jesus in our scriptures. And I think he wanted us to remember her and this story because she's an example of the kind of singular and devotional love, with all the risks such love brings, that as Christians we're called to live into. She modeled a kind of love in action that most of his male followers, including the men at that dinner table, fell short of most of the time. So there is both scriptural and historical record that women were leaders and teachers in the earliest Christian churches that formed after Jesus' death and resurrection. This is an image, the next slide is an image from the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome that is understood to be showing a woman leading prayer. In the book of Acts, there's a story about a man named Apollos who was well educated and effective in his use of the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord and spoke as one stirred by the Spirit. When Priscilla and her husband Aquila heard him, they received him into their circle of friends and explained to him God's way more accurately. So he was pretty good, but he needed a little encouragement and further instruction, and Priscilla was one of the people who did that for him. St. Paul also mentions Priscilla as well as other women in his greetings to the church in Rome, in the part of our Bible which is made up of letters, some of them written by St. Paul to different church communities in the early Christian era. And it's a beautiful little text because it shows how integrated women were in the life of the early church as teachers and leaders and workers. He sends greetings to people named Mary and Junia, Tryphenia and Tryphosa, to mothers of Rufus and to Paul's own mother, to Julia, Nereus' sister. And so it's just an example, again, of how even though, as Leah said, our texts were written by men and have been interpreted by men for most of Christian history, there's these moments where the reality of women's participation slips through. And it's so clear when you see them in that light. And that's important because there are a few places in our scriptures that contradict with that tradition. For instance, in Timothy, it is written, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, rather she is to remain quiet. All I can say to that is Priscilla did not remain quiet, nor did the pagan woman, nor did the woman who anointed Jesus' feet with oil. They spoke with their words and actions, and the authority of their faithfulness was greater than that of the men around them. But there is a tension in Christianity between what seems like a clear record that women are equal and worthy as disciples of Jesus Christ, as teachers and leaders, and some of the texts, such as the one I read from Timothy. And I don't think we should toss those texts out. Some people say, well, let's just take them out of the Bible. But I think it's important to study them and consider why they were written. Paul's letters are always written to a specific group of people in a specific context. And I think it's also important to understand, especially as Christians, because for the most part, we read in translation, how did the people who translated those texts influence the words in translation and the interpretation we have of them? I also think it's worth asking whether these texts align with the clear voice of God we hear throughout the scriptures of our three faiths, calling us all to greater liberation and equity and justice. But ultimately, Christian denominations deal with that tension differently. So different churches and people within the denominations deal with that tension in different ways. There's no one universal Christian understanding of the role of women in faith. But I did want to talk a little bit about my tradition, which is United Methodism, which I like to say began with a woman. Susanna Wesley was the mother of John and Charles Wesley, who founded Methodism. She was born in 1669, married John and Charles' father, Samuel, who was an Anglican priest. He was often in and out of debtor's prison. They had a lot of financial problems. They had a huge house fire one time where John almost died. And she had 19 children over 20 years, 10 of whom lived. And part of her epitaph reads, "True daughter of affliction, she, inured to pain and misery, mourned a long night of griefs and fears." But she was quite incredible. The 10 children who lived to maturity, she educated by herself in their home using a daily program of instruction in religious and worldly matters and ethics and personal devotion. Each child was taught to read by age 5, both the boys and the girls. Susanna said, quote, "Making children learn sewing before they can read perfectly is the very reason why so few women can read." And she would not allow that for her daughters or her sons. And she was also a preacher and a teacher. She started holding devotions in her kitchen, which by 1711, 200 people somehow were attending, packing the house and leaning in through the windows. So she was a huge influence on John Wesley, and it was her advice he most often sought in personal and theological matters. I think it was his mother's influence in 1787 that helped him to come to authorize a woman to preach, despite the objections of his male colleagues. I wish we could get the picture, because the next person I'm going to talk about is Jarena Lee, who was born in 1783 to freed black couple in New Jersey. She taught herself to read and write, and at the age of 20 joined a church in Philadelphia led by Richard Allen, who later went on to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church after he had been dragged away from the communion rail in a white church by men who were enforcing segregation. But Jarena felt a call to preach. So the first time she talked to Reverend Allen about it, he said, well, you could respond to the sermon from where you are in the congregation, but women can't preach. And Jarena wrote, "If the man may preach because the Savior died for him, why not the woman? Seeing he died for her also. Is he not a whole Savior instead of half the one?" Which was a really good question. So eventually she started preaching anyway without permission, and she was so powerful, and Reverend Allen was so impressed that he finally did authorize her to preach the gospel in 1819 as the first woman authorized to preach in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1827, Isabella Baumfree, an enslaved woman who later changed her name to Sojourner Truth, was emancipated when slavery was abolished in New York State. That same year, she co-founded a Methodist church in upstate New York. In 1843, she was called to travel and preach, and of course, she became a leader in the abolition movement, and her preaching on both her faith and combined with her experiences of being enslaved changed the hearts and minds of people throughout the country. Women in the Methodist tradition have also been leaders in a broad social movement that happened among Protestant women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that experience gave millions of women the experience of leadership in the church and in society. They advocated for social justice for women and children. And during this time, a woman named Anna Howard Shaw became one of the first women to be ordained in the church. And Frances Willard fought for social justice for women in civic life, and also for women's full inclusion in the life of the church, which is something I think we're still working on. We have women bishops now, but 17 out of, 80, 60? We still haven't achieved equity, but but it's a work in progress, and I think the bravery of the women who first took those steps, and Anna Howard Shaw's experience especially, is amazing. She took one step forward in ordination and then was constantly rejected, and finally she was ordained. So in the 20th century, United Methodist women worked to change the racist attitudes and laws in the United States. Alice Knott's, the next slide is her book. She calls it a grassroots movement of women in local church groups who helped change attitudes, practices, and even federal policies relating to race relations and civil rights. These women used their personal relationships as a tool for change. Methodist women who are black and white, from different backgrounds, educationally and class, met together and intentionally took it upon themselves to learn about the experiences of other women. And they had to do this in their homes because the churches were still segregated at that time. So for both black and white women, this meant taking risks. They were ostracized and there were threats of violence against them. But these experiences raised the consciousness of white women and dispelled the misconceptions that feed prejudice. And they really provide a model for us today, I think, and this is an example of the work of how building relationships and hearing each other's stories dispels prejudices. I think I just want to say that this movement in particular of Methodist women in the South, black and white women working together, really laid the groundwork for integration in the civil rights movement in a way that we don't always hear of. We hear a lot about the leadership of men in that movement, and that's important and powerful and should be honored. Women also played a huge role in trying to move the country forward in justice. Today, our United Methodist social principles, they're really long, but don't worry about that. But they affirm that women and men are equal in every aspect of our common life. And the organization called United Methodist Women, which really grew out of these societies, had to shout out to UMW. So I'll say, when I first joined the United Methodist Church, I wasn't raised Christian or Methodist. When I first joined the church, I was like, oh, United Methodist Women, they probably drink tea and eat cookies. And turns out they're like incredibly radical social justice organization. It's a global organization of women leading social change for rights and equity for women and children. So they're awesome. And I think I have their website on the next slide. So the role of women in Christianity is as diverse and varied as the lives of every woman who lives in faith. From the faithfulness of Mary to women throughout history and to this day who serve and live their devotion to Christ and his message of inclusive love and healing, grace and salvation. In their faith, women continue to transform the world in small and huge ways. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Reverend Mary Rawlinson. So we've just heard 3 very informative presentations on women in faith from the 3 perspectives of the Muslim, the Jewish, and the Christian faith. I hope you have written down your questions. If not, you still have time. We're going to take a short break, and then we will be called back then for the question and answer session. So thank you very much.
So let's start. We're going to start with one question that is for all 3. Okay, this is interesting. Why do some women in your faith tradition wear headscarves? This is for Christian or louder, okay. Why do some women in your faith tradition wear headscarves? Christians, Catholic nuns,
I'm not sure I know the full answer to that. Sister may be able to help me. But I believe it's a tradition that...
It's hard for me to hear you.
So
You're not going to be clear at all. Your mouth is too far away. Okay, there you go.
Sorry, I'm pausing now. Now I'm not saying anything. I think it's a tradition of women to cover their hair and their heads. That is in the Christian tradition as well as Islam and Judaism as a symbol of modesty and humility is my understanding. But that's not actually part of my tradition, so I don't feel thoroughly qualified to speak to it. So I'll let my sisters here.
You might have seen many, the vast majority of American Jewish women who do not cover their hair. So you might say, oh, look at this one, isn't she weird? And the answer is yes. But I'll tell you that Orthodox women typically do. Often they cover their hair with wigs, like very fancy high-end wigs that you just can't tell. But as a faith leader, I chose not to do that. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that men in Orthodoxy cover their heads from like as young as they can keep something on their heads, and with a yarmulke or a kippah. And the reason why they do that is because it's a reminder of God's presence and a stature of humility, like a reminder that there's always something kind of over your head, outside of your head. Whatever you're thinking, there's something above that. And I love that, and was always, growing up, was always like very jealous of it, in part because of the message behind it, and in part because when you're a man and you wear a yarmulke, if you're in an airport, people come over to you and they start talking to you, and they're like, oh, I'm also Jewish, and blah, blah, blah. And you kind of represent Judaism wherever you go because you're recognizably Jewish, whereas Jewish women are not recognizably Jewish. And I was always very jealous that they kind of represented us with just walking down the street. And I used to tell people, like in high school, I'd be like, oh, I have such hijab envy. Because like Muslim women have that same opportunity. It's very recognizable. You walk down the street and everyone kind of knows who you are and what you represent. And so Orthodox women, we start covering our hair when we get married. And that's the time, that's like a transitional moment in terms of a number of practices, and one of them is hair covering. And so I was making decisions about how I wanted to do it. I'm not committed to this style for the long term, but in Israel, a lot of women who are sort of where I am religiously will cover their hair in just this way. It's still kind of unusual in the United States. It's also a lot more comfortable than most wigs and most hats. So it really has that going for it, and it's fun, and I like it. So that's kind of my answer. But in terms of why Jewish women cover their hair at all, part of it is that women, like most places in the globe, for most of history, covered their hair. And so Jews were part of that, and that was just considered like standard sort of female dress and modesty. And when that fell away, Jews were very traditional, and so we kind of kept it. And some of it also derives from the Torah says that when a woman is accused of adultery, there's a whole ritual called the Sota ritual, and she'll go to the temple, and there's a way for her to kind of prove her innocence. But part of that ritual is that the Torah says ufara et rosh ha'isha, that you kind of like undo the hair of a woman as part of that ritual. And we learn from there that if a woman is married, her hair should be, if you can undo it, then it should be done. Kind of the opposite of that. And so there's a sense that some form of hair covering is a Torah requirement for married women.
Thank you for the question. I went to college in Rhode Island in a heavily Catholic kind of area of Providence, and while I was there one summer, taking summer classes, I wasn't living on campus, and I would keep running into these people who would call me sister like all the time, because I guess they thought I was a very young nun, in that community. And two friends of mine who are sisters, they're both they're Muslim. and they're Syrian. And one of the sisters, she does her hijab like you do, and the other one dresses more like me. And when they're out together, people never know what to make of them. They think they're like a Jewish and a Muslim, like interfaith, friends, and they're blood sisters. In any case, I do want to say that in the United States, Muslim women are equally as likely to not wear a headscarf as they are likely to wear a headscarf. That's not always the case around the world, but here, because of the vast diversity of the Muslim community here, and also the different interpretations of a particular verse, people will dress in different ways. You won't necessarily know who is Muslim and who is not based on how they cover. You also won't necessarily know what their political views are, what their kind of attitudes about life are, just because they cover or they don't. And the verse that most people will refer to in the Quran, there are actually two verses in the chapter of the light. And the first one tells the believing men to lower their gaze and to guard their chastity from the women that are forbidden to them. And directly after that, the next verse says, and tell the believing women to lower their gaze and safeguard their chastity from the men who are forbidden to them. And to then also take their veils, the word khumur in Arabic, which was understood to mean their head covering, because the Arabs at that time lived, in the desert, and they still do, and most people who live in the desert cover their heads. And so they're told to take their head covering, part of that, and to cover their chest with it. So a lot of people will, kind of interpret this verse as this commandment to modesty, right? And modesty changes. The idea of modesty changes depending on your culture and the time, the place that you're at. So that's why there's a bit of diversity in that. But that's the verse. That's why I cover, because I feel like it. For the way I understand this verse, it is a commandment. It doesn't happen after a woman gets married. It's not related necessarily to your marital. It's not related to your marital status, but is after a woman has reached puberty or has reached what is considered in Islamic law the age of morality. Like you're old enough. Like in the U.S., it's 18. I don't know. A lot of 18-year-olds have have the moral understanding, saying what's right, what's wrong, and they have the ability to choose for themselves how they want to live. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Sister, would you like to comment on this?
It's optional for us as religious sisters. Okay. But it's the same thing.
It seems to
some
me...
do, but some do not.
I'm Catholic, so I grew up going to church with something on my head until I was about 17, and it was exactly the same reasons that you are.
Yeah, pre-Vatican too.
Yeah, pre-Vatican too. Right. Thank you. Okay, next question. Again, we're going to do it all 3-1. How are you received by men in your religious group? Are you listened to, believed, respected?
I can start. I'll just go quickly. So I'm not a rabbi or a reverend or a priest, because in the Islamic tradition we don't. Most Muslims don't. There's no ordination, first of all. So an imam is not an ordained religious leader. What we have in Islamic traditions and the Sunni traditions are people who go to what is equivalent to seminary, and then they graduate from that as religious scholars. As one of the words is mufti, which is somebody who can give a religious, legal ruling, or a qadi, which is a religious judge. And those two, that whole aspect of education is open to men and women, and we have qadis and muftis in the United States who are women as well as men. I'm not that. I'm a layperson in that sense. Having said that, because I'm a layperson, I do have to have a certain amount of religious education when I speak with men in my tradition around, especially the work that I do around mosque inclusion of women, young people, converts, and people from interfaith families. And I have to really know what not only the Quran has to say and what the Prophet's example was, peace be upon him, but also what the tradition has turned into. I really have to know my history, because Otherwise, people will push back with you with the weight of tradition. Having said that, the only kind of pushback or disrespect that I receive is not from most of the men or the imams or the elders of the community. It's with these sort of young guys on social media who are probably attacking everyone, kind of incognito. You don't know who they are, and they're just attacking you online. But most of the people who I work with, they might push back at me gently, but if you come to them with this information, armed with your own understanding of the tradition, it's very respectful back and forth.
I mentioned that the first woman in my denomination was ordained in 2009. As you might know, that was very recently. And so it's a transition, and for people who are very, very traditional and who value tradition extremely highly, change is really hard. And so on the one hand, many men and many women are very excited about the innovation that is female scholarship in our community, and many are not. Men and women alike. They say, and they feel like, I do this because I'm traditional, and this is a break from our tradition, and so I'm not interested. And the way that gets expressed is lots of different ways. So some people ignore, and some people are aggressive, and some people do something in between, or they talk about it privately. But yeah, the issue of women like me is very, very hot in our community for the last 10 years, and will continue to be for a while. I would not say, meaning the premise of the question was that men and women might react differently. I have not found that premise to be true. I found many women who are defensive of the traditional role of women in the way that men feel defensive of that traditional role. And in some ways, women even more so, because I threaten the status that they have, meaning if they've achieved a certain role within their community without this kind of scholarship that I have achieved, then my existence is a little bit threatening, right? Like now I represent a movement that says, no, actually to be in a leadership role as a woman, you need to have studied Torah very, very seriously and passed exams and invested all this energy, and in that light, with that kind of way of viewing leadership and achievement, then what about this other path to leadership and achievement that has always existed for women within our community, and what does it say or reflect about that? And so we try and use very pluralistic language, try and not make people feel defensive or scared, or we're trying to push them out. We're not. We're trying to inspire. We're trying to help people love the Jewish tradition and the Torah and God. But it's a very challenging moment for us, and to many people, I and my Orthodox female colleagues represent that challenge in a big way.
So in my context, women have been formally ordained in the United Methodist Church since the 1950s. So it's a different context, and I have felt supported and heard and listened to by the men that I interact with in the faith. I also see things from a different perspective. My husband is also a pastor, and so he has had the experience of people in the church when he arrives saying, "Oh, I'm so thankful we have a man as a pastor," which is not something anybody would. So we're very polite Methodists, and so nobody would ever say that to me. So they think they're being nice to him, I guess, and he reports back to me. We powwow on how to deal with that, but that's a real thing, and it comes from women mostly, actually. So we're all a work in progress in faith and in the world. I think it surprises people when we wear a collar. People who've come from Catholic tradition aren't used to seeing women in a collar. People who've come from Protestant traditions where women might preach, but they don't wear the outfit. And so that I really enjoy walking around, taking the L, wearing my collar, going to the Gay Pride Parade, wearing my collar, because it encourages people to ask. And for the most part, people are just, men and women are just curious. What is it like to be a woman leader in the Christian church? And as I mentioned, I didn't grow up Christian. I had a lot of prejudices against Christianity. One of them was, well, they're all misogynists. And so it's been a learning experience for me to realize that's absolutely not the case. And we have a rich history throughout the different faith denominations of women in leadership roles. Even when they're not formally able to be ordained, women are tremendous leaders in the Catholic Church and in other denominations where that formality may not be there, but they are certainly listened to and heard by men, and also face stumbling blocks. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This question is for you. In the Islam, I can't hear. Okay. 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 In pre-Islam, why were daughters buried alive? Was it limited to certain groups, or did it apply to all female ladies?
Well, it couldn't have been all female ladies because we wouldn't be here. The Arabs wouldn't be here. But in the Islamic tradition, the teaching was that there's a really unequal society in pre-Islamic Arabia, not just around the patriarchy which existed, but also around the financial, the economic elite, the political elite, and everyone else. And so part of the tradition, the idea that in the Islamic tradition, the idea is that all the prophets have come to bring back God's word of justice. And so in pre-Islamic Arabia, you had the existence of an oppressive economic elite, and that manifested in slavery. It manifested in kind of people taking advantage of the poor, those people who didn't have powerful families, and it manifested in the patriarchal murdering of baby girls. And so that's the teaching of Islam, is that once Islam was revealed, that these social inequalities were meant to be tackled through worship of God.
Thank you. This is also for you. To what extent are women permitted to take leadership roles in the Muslim faith?
So, as I mentioned, leadership roles, at least in the United States, there isn't an ordination process. An imam isn't necessarily the imam that you meet. Well, maybe the imam that you meet now is somebody who has, an academic religious background, who studied and has passed exams and is legitimately a religious scholar. But that's not necessarily all people. So, like, I could be an imam. An imam, the word imam in Arabic means prayer leader, right? And it's actually just a role. It's not necessarily a title of somebody. And so the idea of leadership in Islam is so vast. Women can be chaplains, for example, and are chaplains in the military, in hospitals, at universities. You have scholars in residence in several mosques, and that's something that I personally work with mosques to think about. So if you have an imam who is a religious scholar, who else do you have in your community who can be a scholar in residence, who can offer religious support not just to the women but also to the men in the community from a woman's perspective? You also, as I mentioned, have women who are judicial leaders who have the ability and have the actual authority to interpret Islamic law. And we in the United States, obviously the law is the Constitution, but most Muslims will sort of refer back to what do our legal scholars say about something such as receiving an interest-free loan to buy a house or something like that, right? And a Muslim woman who is a religious scholar can actually, kind of adjudicate that. And so the question of leadership is really different. I can also say that most mosques in the United States, over 2/3 of mosques, in their constitutions, they allow for women to run for president and vice president. but less than a third of mosques in the United States actually have a woman who is currently or has been in the role of an elected president of their mosque. But it exists, and I'll also just kind of end by saying, right after 9/11 in 2001, a woman was elected for the first time to be the president of the Islamic Society of North America, which is an umbrella organization, which is the first of its kind around the world to have a woman be the elected leader of a national Muslim organization. And so far, she's been the only one here in the U.S., but she's not the only one around the world. And so the question of leadership is different. It's not just around religious leadership in terms of who leads the prayers, but and who leads the mosques. And so, for us, we really have to identify the fact that this is actually part of our tradition. And those people who say that it's not part of the tradition, that women should not be, let's say, in the role of a mosque president, that hasn't been the tradition. So,
thank you. This is for our Jewish leader. I just came back from the Holy Land, and I noticed there are so many holidays during the month of September. Can you explain to us what they are? We have 2 minutes. Just kidding.
Hi. I actually just want to, first, by way of being the Jewish speaker. So my title is a little bit confusing. You might not have heard of a rabbanit before. And the reason why in the Orthodox community I use a feminized version of the word rabbi. Okay, so that's what the word is. It's the word rabbi, but feminized in Hebrew. And the reason for that is that men and women in our community still today play different roles, and so it recognizes that I, even as a religious leader, have some different roles and opportunities and responsibilities than male religious leaders who pass the same exams and have mastered the same knowledge that I have. So the title is Rabbanit, and it's confusing, and you can call me Leia. Okay, so with that, holidays. We have a lot of holidays. They are all described many times in the in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish tradition, the one and only Testament, they are as follows. So on the first day of the month of Tishrei, that we count our years and our months starting from separate days. So that is the new year. It is also the 7th month. The new year is celebrated for 2 days at that point. 10 days later, on the 10th of the month, so that's the 1st and the 2nd of Tishrei. On the 10th of Tishrei, we have Yom Kippur. So we have our new year, and then we have the Day of Atonement. So on the new year, we blow a horn, we kind of celebrate God's kingship over the earth, and we recognize, and we celebrate the creation of the world, and we also recognize our own smallness in relationship to that, and we stand before God then a few days later and say, we're so small, and we mess up all the time, but please absolve us and keep us in relationship with you and help us to feel renewed and refreshed and free of sin. And we use that time and the month before, which is called the month of Elul, that's the 6th month in our calendar, to kind of repent and work on ourselves and become better people. And it's wonderful to have us, you guys also have this, to have a designated time of year where you do that. Because then if you did it all year, there would never be a time where you open up the books and work on it hard. And that's what we have during those kind of 2 months. So that's Rosh Hashanah, 1st and 2nd of Tishrei, the 7th month. Yom Kippur, the 10th. On the 15th, we build huts. And that is a festival holiday. That's different. There's 3 main commandments of that holiday. The first is to be happy. And the second is to build a hut and live in it. And the third, and as a memory of the temporary dwellings that the Jews lived in when they were in the desert after leaving Egypt, and the protection that God gave us at that time. And the third is it's a harvest festival, and I was mentioning before that we take plants during that time and we wave them in celebration of the harvest, and we pray for rain also at that time, because in Israel it only rains in the winter, and you need the rains to come or else you will starve. So we pray for rain and for kind of weather well-being for the world also on that holiday. And then, so that's the 15th and the 16th. And then kind of 8 days later, we have another 2 holidays kind of to mark the end of the holiday of Sukkot, which is the holiday. And the last one of those is we read the Torah on an annual cycle. We read all of it through every week. We read a portion, next week we read the next portion, and we finish that cycle on the end of that holiday. That was like a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, something like that. And so we celebrate the physical, the Torah scroll, and are having completed reading it in a really, really lovely holiday where we like dance in the streets with our Torah scrolls, and it's really fun. And it's a great holiday for kids also. So that's all. Oh, and there's like a minor fast day in there also. The 3rd of the month of Tishrei is a minor fast day, mourning the loss of Jewish sovereignty at the end of the first temple in Israel. The last people to go into exile after the first temple was destroyed. Pretty packed month.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is for a Christian speaker. Is there a local organization for Christian women to work together on social justice issues? And church is small and could use some allies.
Well, there are community organizing groups that organize with Christian interfaith, in an interfaith way, but with Christian churches that are specifically working on social justice issues. I'm not familiar with this area, so I don't know what those community organizing groups are, but I would look for community organizing Southwest Side. I'm quite sure that there are organizations that are doing that work and can come to your church and work with the women or whichever group is working on social justice in your community, not just church, but for temples and mosques as well. And then, I'll just put another plug in for United Methodist Women. If you go to their website, they have a number of resources on racial justice and other issues, human trafficking, domestic violence, specifically issues that affect women. And those are resources that anybody can use in any context to do book studies or presentations in your church about those issues. And they also have recommendations on how you as a church, a small community, can really impact those issues, both in your community and around the world. So I hope that helps. I also just want to amend my last answer for a minute and just say, just acknowledge that I'm a white woman, and so that gives me a lot more privilege in the context of my church meetings and groups than I have colleagues who are non-white who face much more discrimination than I have because they have those two things that people are responding to. So I just wanted to say that because I forgot to.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is for all three. Describe for us your vision of roles for women in the future to shape society. No small problem here. You got a dissertation. Are you needed?
Equality. I think that every opportunity that is open to anyone should be open to everyone. And I also think that it's convenient to have this conversation be just about women, but as you mentioned, and you also mentioned, this conversation is also about socioeconomic status, it's also about race, it's also about ability, it's also about orientation, and all sorts of ways that human beings have found to discriminate against each other. We're very creative in that regard. I hope that we can find a way to stay connected to history and to tradition and see those as sources of strength and wisdom, and at the same time move forward towards equality, because I think that's what God intended for us.
So I'll just speak about in American Muslim communities what I would like to see, and I think it's very doable because we've started the work, and it's continuing. But I would like to see for every mosque in the United States, first of all, to let women in. Not all do. The ones here do, definitely in this area. I would like to see every mosque in the United States have women pray in the main sanctuary without a barrier, without a physical barrier, if they would like to do that, as many mosques already do. And I would like to see all mosques in the United States have programs, if needed, to encourage women and to actually have women serve on the board. So first of all, to have elected boards on mosques, which most American mosques do have an elected board that leaves after a certain amount of time, but also to have that board have an equal number of women as men, and also, let's say, an equal number of young people as well as men on that board. I think it's really, really, really critical for the voices of the people who attend the mosque, whether they're young people, whether they're converts from different cultural traditions, whether they're people who are from interfaith families, whether they're women, whether they're recent immigrants, refugees, or not, to also have a say in how the mosque is run, and then to also be held accountable by the rest of the congregation. And, this is definitely doable. This isn't me saying, oh, I want to stop, global warming in 2 years. This is doable because it's already starting to be done. It's already being, it's part of the official program of the Islamic Society of North America, and they work with mosques across the country to actually do things in a timely manner to do so. And we work with 2 mosques here in Chicago, one in Willowbrook and one up in Skokie, to do that. And so it's doable.
I think a world in which all human beings have equity in the decisions that affect them and their lives is a vision that I hope for, and that women can claim authority and power without reproducing the kinds of hierarchies that have oppressed women traditionally, and that we can be leaders in a conversation about how to do that, because we're not always very good at it as human beings. And so that women could lead in an understanding of dialogue as a way towards truth, rather than, debate where one person ends up right and one person wrong, but dialogue leading us to truth. And I think also a vision of there not being one particular way to be a woman, that there's a spectrum of gender, and there's a spectrum of expression of gender identity among women and among men, and that all people would feel comfortable and fully aware that God has created them who they are, and that God loves them, and that we would all act toward each other out of that love.
Thank you. This is from a Muslim speaker. Can you summarize 2 to 3 points for non-Muslims to have support when you are confronted with mean, hateful comments? 2 to 3 comments.
Can you read that again?
So yes. It's I'm going to paraphrase if that's okay. I believe what the speaker or the questionnaire would like you to address are to summarize 2 to 3 points that they could use when they are confronted. Because when they're confronted, they're emotional and they really can't think so clearly. So 2 to 3 points they could use.
Okay, so like around Thanksgiving time, when you're confronted with something negative, right? What to tell your friend at Thanksgiving or your relative at Thanksgiving, right? So the first is that get to know a Muslim, right? And it's very, and I mentioned in my opening remarks, most Americans do not know a Muslim. They don't know Muslims. And what they know about Islam, they see it on TV. And that is so problematic for many, many reasons. And so the point for me is it's actually an action. It's not something to say, but for you to get to know a Muslim, connect with the people with the mosques that come here to Swift, connect to these people, do social justice work together, go volunteer together, just get to know us as human beings, and then that interaction will give you a lot of information to sort of to give back to the person who is confronting you. The second point to know is maybe more what the questioner wants to hear is that the U.S. Muslim community is the most diverse Muslim community in the world. So there's no one, I saw a Muslim person do X, Y, Z. Well, that doesn't mean anything because the American Muslim community, first of all, is very small. It's just like less than 3 million people. But this community, there's not one majority group, right? So we have the plurality of the Muslim community in the U.S. are African Americans or Black Muslims. Then you have South Asians. Then a much smaller number of people you have who are Arabs or Middle Easterners. Then you have white Muslims from the Balkans or from other places in Europe, and Latino Muslims. And so just me saying that to you will tell you that the Muslim community is too diverse to say all Muslims believe or do X, Y, or Z.
I hope so too. Get that question correct. If that person feels that they did not, then you can leave after. Thank you. This is for all three of you. Are there any outreach activities in your congregation that encourage you to interact with women of other faiths?
I'll just speak about an experience I had at a community I served previously in Naperville that partnered with the Islamic Community Center in Naperville to hold a community health fair. So that Islamic center had a number of doctors and nurses in the congregation who started a free health clinic, and they wanted to do outreach to the community to let people know that that was there. And our senior pastor was connected to the leadership at the mosque. And then we had a congregation member whose son had died in Washington, D.C. on September 11th, who is very passionate about interfaith relationship with Muslims. And so she led our side of that team to coordinate a health fair with the Islamic Community Center. And it was powerful for both communities, and there's a partnership that is building there throughout time.
The straightforward answer in our community is no. Orthodox Jews kind of don't collectively participate in very much in the way of interfaith stuff. Like big collectively, like the Orthodox Union that sits in DC and negotiates alongside usually Catholics in terms of American policy, they definitely do. And also like evangelicals when it comes to Israel stuff, but I'll stop talking about politics right now. So they're definitely doing interfaith stuff with a very particular goal, but certainly growing up it was not communicated as a value. But on college campuses, like that's where I learned about interfaith and about its value. And I think a lot, that's like the majority of our community where people start realizing like, oh, because we grew up in enclaves, like we go to the Jewish schools and Jewish camps and Jewish synagogue, and then there's like no time for anything else. So even if you're playing soccer, like you're playing it with Jews. And so then you go to college and you're like, well, there's all these other people and they're different. And that's kind of where that starts. But yeah, so in any kind of formal way, not yet, let's say it like that.
I would say absolutely. For the mosques that are connected to SWIFT, there are very regular activities that people can do, whether it's book clubs, whether it's if there's a volunteer event, so like a blood drive or going to the Chicago Food Depository. These activities exist, and actually most mosques in Chicago have these as regular activities, and primarily you have them with young people, so like their youth organizations will do it, but there are specific ones that are just women oriented. A lot of mosques will have gender segregated events, and so these kind of interfaith activities can also be gender segregated. And so I would just recommend that you either call the mosque near you or check out the website. Visitors are always welcome to participate. And that stuff exists all the time.
Thank you. This question is for our Christian speaker. I'm going to paraphrase this. I believe they want to know if women of all Christian faiths utilize women in the same capacity from one congregation to another.
No. But I would say women play different roles in different communities. So I've traveled a little bit in the Appalachian region in the United States, and I had a conversation with a woman there who's came from a church tradition where they dress differently than I would. They wear long skirts and cover their hair, and we were talking about that, and it's clear that women are leaders in that community, but they maybe are not named as leaders. So that's one example. I do think wherever you go in whatever context, whether it's a faith context or in your workplace or in politics, women have a voice, and whether or not it's immediately heard, it's present and powerful. So it's hard to answer that question because there's such a diversity of expression of Christianity, just like probably in this room. So it's I think I would answer that question to say, well, are women treated the same, are girls treated the same way in every school in the United States? Well, they should be, but they probably aren't. There are probably some communities where girls are not valued, or they're not taught the same way, or there's assumptions about girls that don't apply to boys. So I think that's probably the same in churches around the country.
Thank you. This is for all speakers. Does the ongoing Me Too movement speak to women of faith in any special way? Has it affected your congregations in any way?
It's difficult not to talk about politics. Certain things in the news recently, let's say it like that, brought up for many of the women in my congregation traumatic memories of experiences that they have had, and experiences of abuse and of not being heard. And as a faith leader, I felt and feel that when women in my community are experiencing trauma or revisiting trauma, that is my job. Like, it's my job to support those women and to help them in their suffering. That is one of the roles that faith and religion and community play in this world. And so, although we try and keep politics out of our synagogue, and our synagogue is a politically diverse place, we actually held a gathering on Thursday night this past week. As I said in my last answer, we've had a lot of holidays recently, so we've been busy. But on Thursday night, we gathered with women in the community, with me and a woman who professionally counts as like a professional therapist for women who have been abused. And we just like processed together and talked in person. The social media environment is very, very emotionally challenging for people. Like, you can't process difficult things on social media because someone's gonna anonymously yell at you, and that makes it very unsafe. And at the same time, like, we've lost the ability to talk about events in person. And so we had this gathering, and it was amazing. And women and people didn't agree with each other, but they were all carrying this like hurt and desire to like be held in person. And our like faith community was able to create a space for that. So I don't know whether that's like such an orthodox thing, but it's like a thing that our Jewish community was able to do because of the strength of our community and because of the the community that was fostered through our Judaism and our shared religious commitments. And I think it's like affected a lot of women personally in the way that they think about their jobs, in the way they think about the world, in the way that they walk down the street. And so for your community to be a place where you could process that and think about that and feel comforted with that change, like insofar as we're not just a faith but a very, very strong community, we play a tremendous role and have a tremendous responsibility to that.
Anyone else?
I think that says it all.
I'll just quickly say that I echo everything that you have said, with the caveat that one of the things that so the Me Too movement affects all women, right, in the United States, and one of the effects of having Muslim women religious scholars and leaders is that they are able to speak with Muslim male scholars and leaders and share with them, some of their own Me Too experiences. And oftentimes, it's only that allows some of these male religious leaders to think, wait a minute, this actually is also an issue in the Muslim community. And we actually saw this play out last week publicly, where a nationally prominent imam, commented on the situation with the Supreme Court, that in a way that a lot of Muslim women found very hard and very triggering. And he then was very open to having a conversation with not just Muslim women scholars, but just Muslim women, laity, who were going back and forth with him. Within 24 hours, maybe it wasn't a perfect response, but within 24 hours, he fully responded and apologized for the things that he felt that he had said incorrectly, because he didn't want to harm any survivor, but that he listened. And I think this is actually, while I do think that social media can be very, very, very damaging, social media was also the conduit, or one of the conduits, through which he listened to his congregation, which is national. And also the women religious scholars who spoke with him personally, including, as I mentioned, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, who was the first elected president of ISNA, who spoke with him personally and allowed him to really realize that this isn't something that is happening over there, right? That Me Too is happening in the mosques as well. So I hope that answered the question without being too political.
I just want to add one thing, which is that, like, from a more global, you made me think of this, from a more global, like, Jewish perspective, outside of, like, my particular Chicago Orthodox community, there's been, like, a takedown happening. The Jewish leaders who have historically abused women, even, like, academics, like people who are in secular universities, who are professors of Jewish studies, but who the way that they study the Jewish world is transformative. There's particularly one demographer of American Judaism. Women scholars came out saying this man behaved inappropriately towards me at academic conferences or in professional environments, and that man is now a persona non grata in the Jewish community. And those women were empowered those Jewish women were empowered to come forward against an incredibly influential Jewish scholar because of the Me Too movement. So it's really, like, deeply influenced, and that's still coming. There's a Jewish philanthropist who's, you'll read about him in the New York Times soon. Like, there's a takedown on, it's made the Jewish press already, but he's like a national figure, and his day is coming. And there will be more, because women are now empowered to speak up, and through social media they can find other women who've had those same encounters. So it's not like, oh, I had this thing, but like it's my fault or I was crazy, which is like a very standard way that people think, that women think of their own experiences. But the minute, like, there's two other women who've had that same experience, and you can find them because of social media, A, you feel more emboldened in your own experience, and B, like, you feel like you might actually be heard. And not that should be the case, right? Someone robs a home, no one says, well, he walked by my home and didn't rob it. But that kind of is how we think about sexual assault for whatever reason. So at least now, like, people are starting to gain a voice.
I just want to say thank you to everything that Hind and Leah have said. I also wanted to add one thing, which is that we're thinking in my little community of women, how do we use our scriptures to reflect on these situations? And how do we lift up the women in Scripture who we see assaulted or raped, and reflect on that experience and use those texts as ways for women who have experienced that trauma today to connect to their faith heritage, and to women throughout time who have had these experiences, and to ask, what does God think of this situation? And just to connect our scriptures. I think one of the opportunities we have as women of faith is to say, well, this isn't new. We have these texts, these stories, and we want to call them forward today, not to say, oh, this has always happened, it's just going to be with us, but to say, these are our stories, and we can tell them, and we can strengthen other women to survive and come together in solidarity with women throughout time who have had these experiences.
Thank you. This question is for our Muslim speaker. Does Islam prohibit education of females and allow only males to be educated? There's a caveat. In parentheses on the bottom, it's Taliban with a question mark.
Oh.
I can't understand you at all.
Okay, I'll say that again. Does Islam prohibit, better?
In terms of what?
No, she's not finished yet.
I'm just, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Does Islam prohibit education of females and allow only males to be educated? And then Taliban in parentheses.
So the answer to that question is no, and that's why a lot of people, both in Afghanistan and now in Nigeria, were very much, and around the world, were very much against the Taliban and Boko Haram and the work that they do to prevent women, prevent girls from getting an education. The answer to that is definitely 100% no. Women and girls, as well as men and boys, are, that's actually one of the obligations of the parent to both of their children, whether they're sons or daughters, is to provide for them an education. So a child actually has the right to be educated or to have that education by their parents. And we have just innumerable examples of Muslim women who were scholars throughout the history of Islam, and I'll just mention two. The first is Fatima al-Fihriya, who lived in the 9th century in Morocco, in what is now Morocco, and she actually started the first, so let's say the oldest ongoing university, the Qarawiyyin University in Morocco. It's still ongoing today, and it was a university that actually had Jewish and Christian and Muslim students as well, who came from Spain. And so that university exists to this day. You could still go there and get a degree, and it was her endowment that started it, and her sister also started hospitals. And so, this education of women, kind of ebbed and flowed based on the culture that the people found themselves in. The second example I'll give is of a 18th century woman in modern day Nigeria, whose name is Nana Asma'u, and she was a scholar. She spoke Wolof, she spoke Arabic, and spoke and written, and she was an educator. And her work, she carried on the work of her father, but her work is still very, very powerful and important today, especially for African American Muslims who return to her schools that are still existing and study there. And so education is actually a right, an obligation of the parent to the child, and a right that a child has, whether they're male or female in Islam. And anyone who doesn't do that is actually contravening Islam, not upholding it.
Thank you. This will have to be the last question, and it's for all of you. What two goals do you have to give women a more equitable presence in your religious groups?
Encouraging girls to see that they have a voice and a role to play in religion, in faith. I think it can start very young. So, and to be aware from a young age that God calls us all to ministries, to do God's work in the world of peace and love and extending mercy. And so to encourage girls and young women, and women of any age, to embrace the independence of their identity in God and in faith. And then I think practically finding ways to support women, especially women, Black women and women of other ethnic women, to come into seminary and to make it easier for them to do that and less expensive. To sort of break down the barriers that women face in religious studies, and so I think when women are more present in leadership, then girls and young women see that that's something that they can do. So one goal would be to encourage more women to speak and be active in their faith, although that sounds ridiculous because women do that. So it's an ongoing goal. And secondly, to break down some of the barriers that women, especially poor women, have to education. And I think that would go a long way to increasing the presence and equity of women in religion and everywhere else.
So put very succinctly, very similar to what you said, education and opportunity. But rolled into education is not just, oh, there's a teacher who will teach you, but a real value. It is essential that you master this text. It is essential that you learn how to read it, right? Like, you're an American girl who's like 10 or something, and like someone opens up a Talmud in front of you that is written, and maybe you've had Hebrew education, you know, if you're lucky, you've had Hebrew education your whole life until now, and someone says, this is the most important text in our tradition, and by the way, it's written in Aramaic. And it's Hebrew characters, but you actually have to learn a whole new language in order to master this text, and it doesn't have punctuation, and it is like written in this very confusing way where there's like layers and layers and layers of text that you have to know like what the various weights of each text is in order to even understand what the questions are. And by the way, in order to identify something as a question, you just have to kind of know, because it's not going to end with a question mark. And in order to interpret these ancient texts, let alone then interpret the interpreters of these ancient texts, you have to work really hard, and someone has to care that you do it. They have to care that you do it the same way that they care that you someday are independent and can support yourself financially. And if we tell girls, like, yeah, you have these opportunities, but it doesn't really matter because you're a girl and no one really cares whether you have mastered this text or not, then they're not going to do it, because whoever does hard things if they don't matter? Nobody. It has to matter. And so to say, yes, like, we have an education, and also it is of primary importance to the Jewish people and to God that you pursue it, and that you work hard at it, and that you master it, and that you study in your own time, because that's how you achieve in Jewish life, is through being educated. And no one has told women that the amount of work that it goes into it is worthwhile until very, very recently, and even now. It's a really ongoing struggle. And then once you're educated and once you put in all these hours into this, instead of playing the flute, you know, what do you do with it? Where do you go with it? What happens next? And the answer is, like, those are the roads that I and my colleagues are trying to build now in terms of opening up opportunity. So education, and education that matters, and opportunity.
I already mentioned my goals for mosques, so I will say two other things. The first is for every Muslim to realize that the Prophet Muhammad's example, peace be upon him, is not just an example for men, but it's for women. And so that the prophetic model of leadership, which is a servant leader, not a king prophet, but a servant prophet, is something that we all need to learn and that we all need to go back to. And that so that's the first thing. So for all Muslims to really understand and learn and dive into the prophetic character of leadership. And the second is that having women or having people of different ethnic backgrounds, or having even young people on your board, even though I mentioned that as a goal, or who are speaking at your events, that it's not a token. That this inclusion of women in every heart of your mosque or your religious community or your work is actually part of that prophetic model that I mentioned. And so I want that to be a goal. It's kind of a vague goal, but I still think it's doable if we break it down into metrics and come back in a year if people actually identify this as something that's important and prioritize building mosques that the Prophet, peace be upon him, if he saw today, would recognize as being part of his community.
Thank you. That will conclude our question and answer.
Make sure it works. Okay. Well, I want to thank our speakers. I think we really got a lot from them. So I want to thank them especially for being here tonight and for today and for participating in this and give us all the insights that they did. So let's thank them. And of course, I want to thank everybody for being here. You made all this possible by being here. We do have some more than symbolic, well, these are symbolic. I'd like to thank Hind Maki for her participation and help her remember what she did. Okay. And I'd like to thank Rabbanit Leah Sarna, even though this says rabbi, but that's okay.
It's not going up in my office.
As a Reformed Jew, I can say, well, some things are a little different, but not that much. And of course, there's Reverend Mary, not Marie, I had Latin. Reverend Mary Rawlinson. And we want to and then, now, we're not done yet. I don't know who's here to take this, but we want to thank Faith United Methodist Church. Let's see. And thank you, everybody, for being